You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Good morning and welcome to the Business Hour. I'm Ron Comacho, your host. And today's business is part 2 of trees, which we talked about with my guests, Seth Hawkins and Marilyn Beckley, just a couple of weeks back. And now we're taking that talk and extending it to talk a little more about trees. I want to read you, and I don't typically read the promo that we send out about the upcoming program, but the subject matter on this was, are trees critical to the survival of humankind? And it goes on to say, what organism can live for 2,000 years, clean the air of toxins, produce oxygen, significantly reduce erosion and flooding, lower the temperature in cities, act as fuel, is one of the most durable, sustainable, and beautiful building materials? And the answer is wood. And wood comes from trees, and trees make up our forests. And if we don't manage our forests intelligently, life on Earth will not be the same. Seth Hawkins, who is with the Georgia Forestry Commission, is someone who's been educating a broad range of audiences, along with hands-on forest management. Seth has helped to teach folks about good principles of forest management. Seth, do you pretty much agree with that introductory statement?
Yeah. So the Forestry Commission's main goal is just to help have a sustainable, healthy forest in the state of Georgia. So.
Okay, so America's forests are definitely vital to our social, our ecological, our economic well-being. And that's true for most nations. They play a vital role in providing benefits such as, I mentioned, clean air, water, environmental security, green infrastructure, habitat for fish and wildlife, and places of historic value and opportunities for solitude and outdoor recreation. It also provides communities with jobs, and many jobs are through forest products and outdoor recreation, and other jobs come from the work we do to sustain and restore health to make forests more resilient. Today, more than 80% of our citizens live in metropolitan areas, and that number is on the rise, hence the importance of managing community forests. Most people connected to the outdoors through their are connected through their neighborhood trees and local greenways, their parks and creeks and streams, the watershed. And our urban areas make up about 3% of our land area, but they contain roughly 3.8 billion trees in the U.S., covering 140 million acres of urban and community forests. And Seth, you're intimately involved in helping people understand all of that. I mean, the value of forests to everyone, but certainly to the residents of Georgia. How would you sum up your role within the Georgia Forestry Commission? I was characterizing much of what you do as educating people, but tell us a little bit more about your role.
So again, the Georgia Forestry Commission as a whole, our main mission is a sustainable, healthy forest, and that's rural forest or urban forests, or community forests. So I work as a community forester within GFC. So my main role really is kind of being backup for city, county governments, K through 12 schools, public universities, civic groups, really any public entity, and whatever their tree goals are. Whether that be tree planting initiatives, outreach. I do a lot of outreach and education for municipal staff, things like that, and a lot of sometimes private company staff as well. It's just all about getting the message out there of the importance of our community forests and how to maintain them and keep them. Because it's a big challenge having a well-maintained community forest. We've taken an organism that grows out in the woods just fine in its setting that it's evolved in, and we're planting it next to a sidewalk in a parking lot. and we expect it to behave the same, and it's not going to. So there's a lot of challenges that go along with maintaining community forests, and that's just what we're kind of here for, is to help communities and counties and whatnot help them out with that.
So, do you actually help communities fashion their public policy related to trees, which is totally different than community outreach in the form of education? They're related because you're educating people about the kinds of things that you're helping cities to then incorporate into their public policies, their city ordinances. Is there still a disparity among cities? And you, of course, are most familiar with what's going on in the state of Georgia, but the state of Georgia is a great microcosm in many ways for the rest of the nation. Not all states. In fact, my impression is that we're pretty much ahead of the curve for most American states, but nevertheless, it's a good microcosm. And have you found that we still have this major disparity among cities where some are extremely tree canopy and urban forest sensitive, and others are really just beginning the process and engaging you to help them kind of make up for lost time?
Yeah. So yeah, there is that disparity there. Thanks for the compliment on Georgia. I would like to think we're one of the leaders, especially at least in the Southeast, but maybe nationally too. I would like to think we are. But yeah, there's definitely a big disparity between different cities, and it's not just based on population size always. A tree canopy, a tree ordinance, or anything like that is really going to reflect the values of the members of that community. So it's all going to be driven by public comment and voting for the right commission or council members to get those goals out there if we want to have environmentalism and community forests at the forefront of a community's goals. So yeah, and again, it's not based on population size. There's some larger cities that have prioritized tree canopy, and there's some that have prioritized other things. And then there's definitely, but when you start getting into the smaller cities, it's much, much more prevalent for them to not have any kind of tree ordinances on the books, or not have any kind of really just a direction for their community forest. A lot of times it's very reactive in smaller communities. Larger cities typically have the funding and the resources and the expertise to be a little more proactive. And you really have to be proactive if you want to maintain a community forest in an urbanizing area. And around the metro area of Atlanta, down around Augusta, Richmond County, Columbia County, down around Columbus, there's some pockets of extreme expansion and growth right now in Georgia. And when the cities that have not prioritized community forest or tree canopy in their development plans, are feeling that right now. They're getting a lot of parking lots with not as many trees. They're getting a lot of just gray infrastructure, where we could be using green infrastructure for things, which is more cost effective and more eco-friendly. Yeah, there's definitely a big disparity there, and that's kind of one of our main missions, is getting out and helping educate people the importance, and not just importance to us personally, but importance to the whole community and importance financially. So
yeah, I would imagine that in some cases there are some communities that are really just beginning to understand that if you build a parking lot, you can counter the traditional wisdom of we need more parking spaces for people to park during the shopping season with, if you have trees which provide shade and a distinct measure of aesthetics as well, but has a range of benefits, that more people will want to come and shop there throughout the year. I think that's something that there have been studies about that very subject, and you're probably educating them about something as basic as put trees in the parking lot and don't just think of parking spaces.
Yeah, I mean, there's been studies showing that people will drive from further to a shop that has trees in front of it. They will spend more for parking. They will spend more time in that shop, buy more items. And even from just a parking lot management point of view, a blacktop parking lot that has tree canopy over can last about 3 times as long as blacktop that's just open, exposed to the sun. So it actually saves a lot of money in the long term to have good canopy over asphalt.
And the parking lot then becomes an example of what can happen throughout a city, because you expand that idea with trees on the street, on the sidewalks, and you're providing shade and reducing the heat sink and making a place more livable. I want to give you and I recently attended a tree conference hosted by the Georgia Tree Council and the Georgia Forestry Commission. You were kind of co-host of the conference, and I learned a lot about what some cities are doing on the leading edge, and the city of Columbus, Georgia, unbeknownst to me, is doing they are doing many things. And one of them is they're just engaging people. I was impressed that they had a few thousand members in their tree organization, but they have done some really great things, and so it's the perfect environment because, as you mentioned, there's a lot of growth, population growth, and so it's a perfect city to have that sensitivity. Had you worked at all with the city of Columbus?
I haven't personally worked with the city of Columbus. My counterpart that works that side of the state, he's been very heavily involved with them since the beginning of his career. And Columbus actually is our longest running tree city. I want to say it's 40 or 41 years they've been in the program. They were the first tree city in Georgia and have done it every year since. So they've been on this train of forward thinking as far as centering around tree canopy for over 4 decades now.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Well, today we're going to touch on issues that are common to forests throughout the U.S. and the world, for that matter. We mentioned unmanaged forest, or we talked about it as managed forests. But we're going to talk about smart principles of managing forest areas and recreation areas. Invasive species and threats to biodiversity will be something we'll touch on. Habitat fragmentation, and we'll even touch on the value of the Amazon forest to the planet in general. Let's talk about managed forest in general. And Seth, conversely, is an unmanaged forest at the heart of the overall health of our urban, rural, and wilderness forests? And would you describe what the range of managed forest really means? How does it translate on the ground?
Yeah. So when we talk about managed forest, we typically talk about a forest that has, a stewardship or a long-term maintenance plan for that piece of property. And that can involve, prescribed burning regimens, that can involve prescribed thinning of the stands. Because, if you leave a forest alone for 500 years, it's going to figure its way out to being an old growth forest and basically manage itself. It was doing that for a long time before we came along and started doing timber operations or anything like that. But because of human-caused disturbance and human activities, we've created these situations where there has to be some management to keep it just healthy and safe. That can, because if we go in after a clear cut, something like that, you'll have a lot of very thick growth in behind it, invasive species, things like that. So again, just kind of human-caused activities have required some of that management in the long term, but it's something that we have to do from a safety point of view, so we don't get fuel buildup for wildfires, so we don't lose trees to insects and diseases and things like that.
We're going to be taking a break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about burning, prescribed burning. You mentioned thinning. We're here with Seth Hawkins of the Georgia Forestry Commission, and we're just going to be talking about what it takes to have healthy trees and the value of a healthy forest to not only your community but to the planet. And that might sound pretty lofty, but in fact what's good for the trees of Georgia is pretty much good for the trees of the U.S. and for the rest of the world. We'll be back to talk more with Seth right after this break.
Last week, my party chief said he wanted to go someplace he had never been before. So, I took him to the rear property line. Sound familiar? Are you tired of trudging all the way to the back of property lines? Why not take the steps to become a crew chief instead? Or even better, why not become a professional land surveyor and see your name stamped on that final survey? The Nettleman Institute of Land Surveying Engineering Technology is your next step. At NICET, We believe you are the future of surveying, and we want to do everything we can to help you succeed at becoming a professional surveyor. NYSET offers the only online 1-year certificate of land surveying program that includes all books, fees, and expenses in one simple price. Visit landsurveycareer.com to stop trucking through the mud and step into your future today.
If your health insurance premium is more than your mortgage, Ellen Deal with Ideal Solutions is here to help. Whether you're a small business owner, individual, family, or baby boomer, email maga45cag@gmail.com and I'll respond with 3 easy questions to help you determine if you can get away from Obamacare. As a 20-year veteran of the insurance industry, I'm here to help with all your insurance needs. Email Ellen Deal at maga45cag@gmail.com.
This is Ron Comacho, host of the Business Hour, on Fridays from 10 to 11 a.m. Join me as I talk with passionate professionals on a program that profiles the best businesses, business practices, and fascinating business professionals to get an insider view of how America works.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the Business Hour. We're here with Seth Hawkins of the Georgia Forestry Commission, and we've been talking about the value of trees to communities, the importance of managed forest, particularly in urban areas. And just before the break, Seth was talking about various aspects of managed forest and mentioned burning and thinning. So there's been lots of back and forth on the conventional wisdom of prescribed burning, but could you tell us, Seth, where we are currently in the state of Georgia, and if you know whether that applies to the rest of the country? And certainly it takes on a whole other dimension when we're talking about places like the West Coast, where you have conditions that render the forest very susceptible to forest fires. But what in a state like our own, where we don't have rampant wildfires, what's the conventional wisdom about prescribed burning?
So prescribed burning, if it can be done safely, and it's a situation by situation basis, but if it can be done safely, it's a great practice to do for the forest from a public safety point of view, from a forest health point of view. So because the southeastern forests are actually mostly comprised of fire-adapted species, and that's kind of a result of the Native Americans in the southeast used prescribed fire for thousands of years before we came along. So it's kind of precluded some species out, and like I said, a true southern forest is a fire-adapted ecosystem. So it actually thrives on that fire, and some species actually depend on fire to help them with the reproduction process, some tree species.
And so the problem comes when you have population centers adjacent to forests.
Correct.
And so the nature of prescribed burning has to be carefully managed.
Right.
Because we're talking about people and structures. But you and I had chatted briefly about Native Americans, and you just said that for thousands and thousands of years, and people forget we're talking thousands and thousands of years of the human population learning about, and it's probably not clear exactly how they learned that a cycle of burning a forest that probably came through a few thousand years of just watching the forest burn and then regenerate itself, and then they realized they could have a hand in creating a fire in an area that eventually would recover. They just kind of may have developed a consciousness about that again over a long period of time. And then today, is it the Georgia Forestry Commission itself or the U.S. Forestry Service that is involved in hands-on prescribed burning?
So both agencies do that. Georgia Forestry Commission is very hands-on, mostly with private landowners, helping them dig their fire breaks and making a burn plan and doing the prescribed fires safely. Because you have to have the right topography, you have to have the right weather. Weather's the big driving factor if it's safe or not, and that's also from a smoke management point of view. Especially in the wildland-urban interface, like around the metro area, smoke management is the biggest safety issue. Because smoke can sock in a highway and reduce visibility on roads and things. So weather is a big thing. So GFC is very heavily involved, hands-on. The U.S. Forest Service also does some prescribed burning, but not quite as much, as they have such a larger, vast amount of land to worry about. And, essentially, going back to what you were saying about the Native Americans, essentially, and there might be an archaeologist or someone or an anthropologist that knows better about how they actually discovered it, the use of prescribed fire. But basically what they were doing and what we're doing with prescribed fire is mimicking a natural disturbance. Fires start from lightning strikes from different sources naturally in the woods without human involvement. And when you have those heavy fuel buildups, that's when you get your big wildfires. We're basically mimicking that natural disturbance with higher frequency to reduce those fuel loads and make it safer to do those prescribed burns.
And you would probably take a totally different approach during periods of drought, I would imagine, or at least the activities just undertaken more carefully, just because there's more fuel out there.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, because if it's too damp out there, the fire won't carry and you don't really get any fuel elimination. But if it's too dry, then you have issues with embers spotting and spot fires outside your fire breaks. So again, that's why you have to just have that certain nice special spot of soil moisture and fuel moisture and humidity and wind direction. And all those things kind of come together, and you have a safe day for prescribed burning.
Aside from the fact that the West Coast is a much more arid environment than the Southeast, is the undergrowth in the Southeast much like the undergrowth? I mean, does our forest look like their forest at all?
It's definitely very different fuel loads here as opposed to out west. Out west, their forests are much more heavily comprised of carnivorous trees, pine trees, and pine needles just tend to carry fire much better than hardwood oak leaves. Southern oak leaves typically have a very waxy cuticle, have a lot of oils in their leaf that actually make a lot of native oaks, like live oaks, water oaks, things like that, are actually very fire resistant because of those waxy leaves, and they just won't carry a fire as well until they're super dried out. But out west, really, it's kind of they have three big things against them. The fuel load being that the pine needle buildup, the topography, and just their wind speed and variability in gusts, and just the arid environment. We're lucky here in the Southeast that we get so many, quote, safe days to do prescribed burning. Out west, they don't get near as many of those days, and it's just such a bigger area. So it's really hard to get rid of those fuel loads.
And what kind of cycles are we talking about typically? Is it 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years? What would be the cycle? Is it more than that?
It really depends on what the landowner's objective is. So if someone's really managing their land for hunting, they might burn part or most of their land every year or two. Because a fresh burned area really encourages a lot of wildlife species to move in and propagate. If you're doing timber production, it might be more on a 5-year rotation for your burns. It's going to depend on the property, on the undergrowth type, and just kind of what the objective for that landowner is. But really, it can be as short as 1 year burn cycles to 5 or 10 year cycles for truly managed land.
What about the wildlife in these situations, Seth? Is that something that you help educate the private landowners, for example, to ensure, or is it just something that instinctively? I know there's probably children out there thinking about poor little Bambi, as they should be, and other creatures. Do they just is the process undertaken in such a way that the wildlife has a chance to relocate? Yeah,
and a great example, my niece actually asked me one time, where did the bunny rabbits go in the woods? That's when I was talking about prescribed fires and things. And so I explained to her that wildlife, they have instincts. They can hear better than us. They can smell much better than us. They smell the smoke. They know a fire's coming, and they just vacate the area. And a lot of your burrowing animals, your rabbits, your rodents and things, if they get under, I think it's 2 centimeters of soil is all it takes to insulate them from that fire moving across. So the smaller animals can burrow down and hide from it. Larger animals can vacate the area temporarily. But you'll see it all too often after a prescribed fire. We run a good hot fire through it. Less than a day later, deer and everything moving back in, getting on that fresh browse and everything that comes up a few days later.
Okay, so for those of you out there where they were a little concerned, that should put your mind at ease. I appreciate that explanation, Seth. What about thinning a forest? Is this done more at the commercial end of the spectrum than it is just for the health of a forest, or do they go hand in hand? Private landowners know they can thin their forests to keep their trees healthier and at the same time sell off some of the trees?
Yeah, so again, depends on management objectives. But yeah, so for timber production, usually they will plant them in real good and tight at first, and then do different amounts of thinning depending on what kind of product they're wanting to produce. If they're trying to go for having like poles, which is what they use for like telephone poles, as opposed to pulpwood, they might keep it tighter spacing. It really just depends on the market that's close to that timber owner and what their objective really is. But also just from a recreation or forest health point of view or wildlife point of view, thinning does improve the health of a forest. An overstocked pine stand is much more susceptible to southern pine beetle infestations and other disease and bug infestations. So when trees are having to work against each other to compete for resources, it weakens them and they're more susceptible to insects and disease. So really there's a lot of great reasons to thin your timber out. And if you think about it, you're kind of just, again, mimicking natural processes. If you look into an older forest, it's usually thinned out more. Just the larger trees have outcompeted, they're shading out the bottom, and you start to get a little bit of thinning. You get fewer larger trees in an older forest. So thinning kind of just mimics that natural process.
You had also, we had a conversation prior to the program, we're talking about I guess it comes down to tree density. I mean, there's a certain point where there's diminishing returns on planting too many trees too densely, and I don't know who would be the guilty parties, and I'm not inclined to want to identify guilty parties as much as to say, or to ask you rather, is that something that you help private landowners understand that they should not overplant so that there isn't too great a density? And I'm going to let you think about that. We're going to take another break. We're here with Seth Hawkins of the Georgia Forestry Commission. We've been talking about what it takes to manage forests intelligently and about the value of trees and the forest in general. We'll be back with Seth right after this break.
The Docs for Patient Care Foundation is your way to join the fight and become a member of an organization created by doctors for patients dedicated to fighting for your healthcare freedom and preserving the doctor-patient relationship. Get a pen and paper. Write down www.docsforpatientcarefoundation.org. That's www.docsforpatientcarefoundation.org. Go to our site and please make a generous tax-deductible donation and join the fight today. Thank you.
Whether cruising the strip in a 57 Chevy or taking the family on a vacation in a 71 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, you need to tune in to Classic Cars with Steve Ronaldo and Jim Weber every Saturday from 8 to 9 a.m. on americaswebradio.com.
Perhaps you are struggling to cope with the disease of addiction. If not, you probably know a family member or friend that needs help in battling the cravings and the personal and professional damage done by the effects of drugs or alcohol. Get a pen and paper and be ready to write down the following. These are the issues that the trained staff at the Atlanta Healing Center address and treat every day. Their doctors and counselors with over 40 years of practice in the field of addiction can treat the suffering individual in a thoughtful, compassionate, and experienced manner and guide him or her along the path to recovery. So call 770-696-9862 and speak to a knowledgeable staff member about how you or your loved one can be helped to enjoy a better and healthier life. More information is also available on the website at www.atlantahealingcenter.com.
Quick Stakes, That's QUIK stakes are not just for surveyors. They are great for family and community gardens. Go online to www.quickstake.com or contact your local land surveying supply dealer and get you a box of Quick Stakes. You'll love them every year when you plant your garden. Again, that's Quick Stakes, QUIK stakes, the truly preferred way to stake and identify what's in your garden now.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the Business Hour. I'm Ron Comacho, your host, and today we're with Seth Hawkins of the Georgia Forestry Commission, and we've been talking about the importance, the value of trees, the importance of intelligently managed forests, particularly in and around urban environments where there are people, because as Seth pointed out, that in the wilderness, a forest fire can start up due to lightning strikes, and will go through a cycle of turning over the tree canopy in a very natural way, whereas in other settings there are prescribed burns. And we then talked about the thinning of forests to keep them healthy. And before the break, I was asking Seth about is it true that some property owners can overplant? Typically, I guess commercial growers trying to get more per acre out of a tree forest. But is that true that you can overplant and create too high density of trees, and that the trees don't grow as well, they're not as healthy, and that one of the things you do is advise them on appropriate density?
Yeah, for sure. So when you're planting pine timber, typically, there's different density rates they'll use, but a really high density rate is 720 trees per acre. So I mean, that's a lot of tiny little pine trees crammed into that acre. And so those aren't left in perpetuity that way. So you plant on that tight so that they start to grow up and straight and just kind of compete a little bit and makes them start to grow into their spot. And then you go in as the years go down the road, as they're starting to grow, and thin those out. Now, it does happen sometimes where that planting happens and then maybe management objectives change, ownership of the land changes hands, just any number of things can happen where that thinning never occurs. And that's when you have these really densely stocked and overpacked stands that are really susceptible to disease, bugs, and wildfire risk as well. Now, another way that can happen is, so sometimes if a clear cut happens or something, and there's a few remaining trees, they might seed them, especially pine trees, might seed themselves in at like 2,000 trees per acre sometimes. They'll just prolifically seed around them because there's all the...
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And those are highly susceptible to southern pine beetle and other beetle attacks and things. So we definitely advise landowners on timing to thin, how much to thin, things like that. GFC can actually formally cruise and valuate timber, but we can definitely arm landowners with as much information as possible. And so when they do hire a consultant or a logger or something, they kind of know what they're doing when they're doing it.
I live on just shy of an acre, and it's kind of hard to imagine my backyard, which is about a half an acre, with 360 trees. Yeah. And also I hadn't noticed a regeneration of pine trees or any other kinds of trees are certainly pop up left and right, but nothing that ever grows to significant maturity, at least hasn't in the last 25 years.
And they typically won't in those overstock situations. It's going to make it look like the trees might be 5 years old. They could be 15 or 20 years old, but they're so packed in there and competing their whole life, they're never really going to reach their full potential.
What's the average lifespan for a North Georgia pine?
So kind of depends. So if you're talking production, so typically a pine stand we run on about 25 to 40 year rotations depending on site quality and specific pine species. But loblolly pines is out in the environment and pine trees, can live to be 1 to 200 years old.
Really?
In the right spots. And so But again, we just don't see those that often, just because pine trees are more susceptible in their long term to like wind throw, and as they get older and start to decline in vigor, to bug and disease attacks. So we don't see a lot of those super old pine trees. But yeah, there's can't remember the exact dimensions on the state champion loblolly pine, but it has to be 150 ballpark.
And what about hardwoods? I know there's a wide variety of hardwoods, and their lifespans have to be varied as well. But let's say a white oak, or what's the most common hardwood in the southeast?
So it depends on what part of the southeast you're in. Obviously, you get south of the fall line in Georgia, you're talking about live oaks. Live oaks are just all over the place in South Georgia, which is great. They're wonderful trees. You get in the north part of the state, I'm not sure what the most predominant hardwood would be. White oak would be up there towards the top of the list. And white oak's one of the longer lived oak trees. I mean, white oak could live 200 to 400 years old or more in the right spot. The state champion live oak, by just a ballpark guesstimation, is probably 550 to 600 years old. And so the way we determine the age, the ballpark age of these trees, we use something called growth factors. And you can Google this online. If you just search tree growth factors, you'll find different tables from different sources. And basically what it is it's a number, so it'll be like 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. And you take the diameter at 4.5 feet off the ground, which is called diameter at breast height, which is what foresters and arborists use. Take that diameter and multiply it by that growth factor for the associated species, and you'll get a ballpark age. So that's kind of how we come up with those close ages of trees without having to take a core sample. The only way to really know for sure how old a tree is to cut it down and count the rings. But obviously that's not the way to go. So
I want to revisit something that you had touched upon in our previous session when Mary Lynn Beckley was with us of the Georgia Tree Council, and I asked you then, and I'll ask you again about there's a popular conception that Georgia pine trees in general, are not as effective in reducing carbon levels and producing oxygen, but that's not really true because of the surface area of the pines. Would you tell us more about that?
Right. So yeah, believe it or not, pine needles actually have more surface area on their foliage, which is their pine needles, than deciduous trees do. It's just organized differently. So it's just kind of a matter of the geometry of it. It's a cone essentially. Little needles. If you look at them real close, it's kind of a tapering cylinder. So there's actually more surface area on that, which provides more opportunities for gas exchange with the atmosphere. So pines are actually really, really good at taking in carbon and giving off oxygen and storing that carbon. Pines also play a great role in stormwater management as well. Again, that increased surface area provides more surface tension, can actually intercept more rainfall than a lot of deciduous trees. Plus, when you factor in the fact in wintertime, when it rains the most in Georgia, our deciduous trees don't have canopy. Pine trees still do. So they play a year-round role in that process.
Something that's even more important than most people have come to realize is erosion control and mitigating floods, particularly in urban areas like cities throughout the southeast where there's vast networks of creeks and streams. I think we're beginning to understand the value of protecting the riparian buffers where in some cases, and I believe here in Sandy Springs, they're beginning to look at not just protection but even planting of more trees around creeks and streams to prevent erosion and to keep the watershed just healthier. Is that your experience?
Oh yeah. So planting and keeping, really not only planting, but if we can keep those riparian areas undisturbed, that's ideal. So leaving the trees that are in place already there, that's holding the soil together, holding the stream bank together. And the more trees you have along your drainage ditches and things like that, it's going to uptake more of that water, and that's less water that goes into the storm drain systems. That's less water that we as a community have to foot the bill to treat to get back into the drinking water system or to get it down the river.
Right. I mean, people think in terms of trees as filtration systems for the air, or maybe they don't, but they are significantly so. But also, as you just mentioned, for filtering water. And so do they actually help in supplying our aquifers with cleaner water?
So the vast majority of reservoir and drinking water that in the state of Georgia either comes from rain that falls on a forest or from what they call aquifer recharge zones that are usually located in forested areas. So forests play a huge role in helping to generate water and get water to the streams, to our reservoirs, but also in cleaning it on the way. Obviously we've all seen at the end of like a muddy road, all that sediment washing down into the ditch, and that's all going straight into the storm drain that at some point has to be filtered out before it can be put into the reservoir, into the drinking water system. So trees play a huge role in stormwater volume management and pollution filtration.
Let's talk about invasive species and threats to biodiversity in terms of forests. What are some of the issues that you help communities better understand about invasive species in general, Seth?
So the Georgia Forestry Commission, we as an agency, we all fight against invasive species. We have a specific group of specialists, we call our forest health specialists. That's one of their main tasks as well, is helping to identify invasive species, where they're at, how much there is, and what's the best way to fix the problem, right? So what we always try to tell people, or at least I myself, try to explain to people why invasive species are a problem. Because, a lot of invasive species, for better or worse, they look really nice. Usually they're pretty, they're flashy, colorful flowers. There's something about them. Because, the majority of the time, a lot of our invasive species are brought in through the nursery trade. And so people are buying them for a reason. And so they buy them, but then no one thinks about, the fact they have no natural control here, as they do in other parts of the world where these invasive species are coming from. The problem with them is they get out in the landscape, have no biological controls, and just multiply unchecked. And that starts to displace native plant species, which in turn messes with the food web, because native animals depend on native plants for their food supply or shelter or any different part of their life cycle. And so that starts to displace the entire food web of an ecosystem.
And would you say that here in the southeast that kudzu and privet are two of the major culprits for displacing native species?
As far from an acreage point of view, privet is the biggest issue that we have in the state of Georgia. Kudzu doesn't have near as many acres as privet when you look at it from an overall infestation acreage point of view. But kudzu tends to be more like, when you see it, you see a lot of it. It makes a complete desert. It's the only thing that grows, and that creates a food desert for all the wildlife that used to depend on that area and the native plants. And privet has been just a huge issue. I was actually working in Clark County yesterday trying to eradicate privet along the riverbanks, and it's a tough job to get it done and really get it gone. And privet, it came to the nursery industry. You can still buy glossy privet in nurseries today, unfortunately.
Well, it kind of looks pretty in some sense, almost like ivy does, and yet it grows rampantly, doesn't it?
And I'm a huge UGA football fan, but every game I watch, between the hedges, those are Chinese privet hedges right there. So just say it.
Yeah, your point about them being brought in, invasive species introduced by nurseries. The city of Sandy Springs, where the station is located here in North Metro Atlanta, is actually beginning to do some things to eliminate invasive species in some of the park-like settings. One in particular along Marsh Creek, working hand in hand with the Conservancy and the Environment Sandy Springs group, will progressively get better, I assume, at eliminating these harmful invasive species and invasive species eradication. We're going to be taking a break. We'll be back with Seth Hawkins to talk more about trees, the forest, and smart managed forests after this break.
Get your pen and paper ready. If there's a move in your near future, I'm here to tell you that the folks I used and now recommend is Around Town Movers. Timothy and the guys recently moved me, and I am and was totally satisfied with a sometimes not so fun experience moving. Call Timothy at 770-378-4708 and make it a good move and a good experience. Around Town Movers for that local or cross-country move. Timothy Around Town Movers, in my opinion, are the best. That's Around Town Movers. Call them. This is America's Web Radio. Would you like to have a show, talk about your business, or express your opinion on America's Web Radio? Just email gm@americaswebradio.com and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mike Mizell. I'm a retired Army colonel and president of the Johns Creek Veterans Association. We meet in Newtown Park, and part of one of our projects is the installation of the Healing Wall, the half-scale model of the Vietnam Wall that traveled the United States. Well, it's coming to rest, and it's going to live in Johns Creek forever, the half-scale model. We're looking at possibly a March implementation ribbon cutting ceremony, and we're looking for donors and sponsors that want to help us in this great project. You can donate at jcvets.org.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the Business Hour. I'm Ron Comacho, your host. I'm here with Seth Hawkins of the Georgia Forestry Commission, and we've been talking about trees, tree health, managed forests, the value of trees to various communities. Before the break, we were talking about invasive species and the threat of invasive species to the health of a forest because it's displacing native species, which are robbing nutrients and displacing the wildlife population and just upsetting the balance of the natural order for a forest and its wildlife. Tell us about forest or habitat fragmentation. What does that mean, Seth?
Yeah, so when we talk about forest fragmentation, basically we're talking about taking what used to be a forest, and as development comes in, housing, something like that, we start breaking that whole forest area up into chunks. And that's really, from the Georgia Forestry Commission point of view, we see forest fragmentation as the biggest threat to Georgia's forests, and that's both rural and community forests. The issues with that, so when you have a forested area, it's just so much better at handling stormwater, at reducing the heat island effect and things like that. And so we talk about forested areas in terms of green infrastructure, which is using trees and vegetative material to manage things like heat islands, stormwater, all those things. So gray infrastructure is your curb and gutter and things like that, which you have to have. It all works in concert, but we really encourage cities when we can to work more with green infrastructure. So when we start fragmenting that green infrastructure or that forest up, we start talking in terms of like green infrastructure hubs, kind of. So there'll be like a pocket of forest over here, pocket of forest over here, and over here. So when those get completely fragmented, their efficacy for what they can do as far as ecosystem services goes way down. When you have those hubs still connected, their green infrastructure corridors and wildlife corridors and stuff, they keep a lot more of their efficacy for the benefits we get from them. And
this is something that you help advise urban centers, municipalities, and counties on, is how to maintain those, the connectivity of those urban hubs, those forest hubs.
And it's not just, like I said, in the community forester, we try to start going towards the green infrastructure as a holistic approach to citywide management or landscape-wide management. It's not just planting trees. It's not just keeping erosion down. It's all of those things working in concert together that form a green infrastructure plan for a community.
Because you're a forestry expert, which does extend to wildlife, to the larger ecosystem. You and I had talked, and relating this to invasive species, not just in the form of plants. We're having some problems with invasive insects. Tell us a little bit about the problem with some non-native insects.
Yeah. So we've had some of the ones that really popped to my mind that I think would be most visible to the listeners. If anybody's been up in the mountains in northeast Georgia or as far as Gatlinburg and all that, the hemlock trees. So the hemlock woolly adelgid is a tiny, tiny, tiny little insect that came from southeastern Asia, as a lot of our invasive plants and insects do, just because it's a very similar climate here to southeastern China and Asia. So we get a lot. Our plants kind of go back and forth, and we have some plants that are here that have come from here that are there now and causing the exact same problems on the other side of the ocean. So it's a two-way street. But a lot of times, so hemlock woolly adelgid is the one I think of now, and it's just devastated the hemlock trees in the mountains. Emerald ash borer is another one that's talked about. It hasn't been as big of an impact in Georgia, just because we don't have as many ash trees. But in the central part of the U.S., where a city will have 25% of its trees are ash trees, and they've lost every single one of them in the last decade. That's been a huge deal. And then going back to Dutch elm disease, the elm trees that all started dying in the beginning of the century, mid-century.
On a positive note, you did mention to me that there was some work at the University of Georgia in conjunction with the U.S. Forestry Department, and I would imagine the Georgia Forestry Commission to create trees which are more resistant to insect infestations and fungus, so that there are some elm trees that might be more resistant?
Yeah. So what they've done is they found some American elm varieties, or just individual trees that didn't get the Dutch elm disease for whatever reason. They just had a natural resistance in their variation of their genome. And they actually have cloned those a lot. And so when you see American elms being planted now, they're usually Princeton or Jefferson American elms. There's also a third variety I can't remember. But they're clones of trees, of parent trees that were resistant to Dutch elm disease. The American Chestnut Foundation, they've actually bred a small bit of Chinese chestnut DNA into the new American chestnut cultivars that give it a lot more resistant to the chestnut blight and the Phytophthora root rot that chestnuts get. So it's really just the best we can do with that situation. This isn't complete immunity. We're talking it's just more higher resistance to those issues.
Well, a great example of managed DNA, I guess, if you will, regarding non-native species of trees to make our trees more healthy, and it's done through experimentation. Mm-hmm. Tell us about Asian needle ants and the Turo spiders.
Yeah, so these are I was actually working out in a park in Clark County yesterday, and these are two of the newest invasive insects that the park manager there is concerned about. So Juro spiders.
Juro rather than Turo, yes.
So they are really, really pretty to look at on a picture. I don't want to see them in real life. I don't like spiders so much. I'm a little scared of them. But they're really pretty to look at. Bright colors. They have a golden web and everything, but they came from, I think, Japan. They came over in packing material to a warehouse in Jefferson, and it is spread from Jackson County. So they're in Jackson Hall and now Clark County. They're expected to spread across the whole. They aren't really. They don't know what the long-term impact of the Juro spider is going to be yet. If it's going to displace native spiders or overfeed on native prey insects, they're not sure. So that's an example of just how easily it just came over in a box.
And what does it look like, Seth?
It's got like some bright reds and yellows and oranges. They're different ones. They're an orb spider variety, if you're familiar. And again, that golden web, it shines like golden thread in the sun. It's pretty neat. It's neat from that point of view, but like I said, we're worried about the long-term impact. Now, the Asian needle ant you mentioned, that was a new one to me. I just ran into yesterday. It is an ant from Asia, and they call it a needle ant because when it bites, it feels like a hot needle poking you. So it's not just a clever name. They think it's going to displace our invasive fire ants, so one invasive is going to be replaced by another. The big problem they see with the needle ant on the horizon is that it feeds primarily on termites that feed on downed woody debris in the woods. So if there's no more termites eating that down woody debris, we're going to have a lot of dry wood build up in our forest potentially if these Asian needle ants really spread and are really prolific. The other problem with them is typically, like our invasive fire ants, will invade disturbed areas, disturbed soil. These Asian needle ants move into undisturbed, totally left alone forests. They'll just move in and colonize it and start feeding on the native termites.
Seth, I know you spent some time with students educating them about the value of trees in the forest, and you probably deal with some very young kids that are just learning about the value of trees in the forest. And what are some of the major takeaways that you want kids, because we can all benefit from those basic principles of smart forest management, simplified, like for a young student. What are Seth Hawkins' top set of things to be mindful of when it comes to managing the forest and trees?
Yeah, we work with kids from kindergarten all the way up until college. You'd be amazed how many second graders can explain photosynthesis to me. It's actually pretty impressive, right? So I really think if people really would dig in and learn about the magic of photosynthesis, it's the closest thing we have to magic on the planet. Everything's predicated upon that. So I think really have an understanding of how plants work and what they really do for us. And really just people understanding the value of green space and the value of trees, because they're not just something to look at, they're an integral part of our lives. And so the more people and the more children and the more young people that are coming up that realize that, that's great. Also, I think resources are more available to these young people, so for them to know what resources are out there, that's great too.
Yeah, and fortunately there is a climate that has evolved to, and you and I talked about this, being in an eco-friendly community, or being personally more eco-friendly, has become cooler than ever.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that when I go into the schools that the kids are all about green ideas and recycling and things like that. Things that when I was a little kid weren't really talked about that much. It was kind of do your homework,
And it's and we're not just having to use methods of punishment for infractions of maintaining a healthy environment. People are actually realizing that it's the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah. All too often in the past, I feel like companies and residents and just people in general have played by the eco-friendly rules because they had to. But now I think people realize it's what we should be doing.
Well, I want to thank you personally for doing what you do, Seth, on behalf of protecting our trees, our forests, working with communities to have healthier forests, which in terms of the larger picture helps the environment throughout the state of Georgia and the Southeast to be healthier. So thank you very much, Seth.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Business Hour here at America's Web Radio. We're on Fridays from 10 to 11 a.m. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on the internet and the radio next week.
You can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan, and every family will save thousands of dollars a year. I'm Ellen Deal, and if you've been hurt by